We have to look at myself. Transparency in the workplace, families, and relationships have increased in all ways possible over the past few decades as how we interact with others progress. Yet, the idea of transactionality remains so taboo that couples are frowned upon from making it any part of their relationship. We think this is the ultimate downfall of the modern relationship. Two pieces of characterization then. Firstly, what does status quo look like? The idea of transactionality, like the info slide points out, is largely frowned upon. You must love one another and cannot be calculated and must be fully and unconditionally loving of your partner, irregardless of the kinds of transactions that may exist in your relationships. You must have things like romantic gestures and not expect anything in return. The point in which you bring it up, you are no longer subscribing to the modern version of what a relationship should look like in the eyes of the info slide. But secondarily, what exactly do we think an exchange of benefits look like within a modern version of transactionality, right? Two main things here. Firstly, that is the idea of clearly stating upfront or at any point within the relationship of what you expect of either this be a monetary expectations, emotional expectations, physical expectations. So I think this looks like partners telling straight up what they can and cannot hear directly and upfront. But secondarily, it's not exactly symmetric all across the board. It doesn't have to be in one way on its own, right? This can look like emotional benefits, physical benefits, as long as there's an agreement between two consenting partners. We think that if this were to change at any point in the relationship, that is, some partner values a certain act or a certain item differently, then this minimizes. We then able to then change how we you're able to bring this up to your partner at any point in the relationship, and it minimizes the harm of feeling of inequality, because we know that there will be cases where one partner wants more than the other. It is simply undeniable. But we think the idea of stating these things up far more earlier in the relationship encourages lesser dispute, and that's fine insofar as that we are more as transparent as possible within the relationship. But three main arguments in my case here. Firstly, when the lack of transparency and the lack of discussion of transactionality leads to the falling apart of relationships in status quo. Three main ideas here, right? Which is that one, couples are fundamentally not transparent upfront in relationships about what they want from each other partner. That is to say, there's a difference in expectation, like be it in the ways in which I mentioned. But secondarily, people also are not willing to demand what they want within relationships because they do not want to be perceived as high maintenance. This can apply either with males or particularly in females who don't want to be seen as high maintenance to their male partners because they want to be shown a little bit more at love and a little bit more at affection. I think these are all completely legitimate in relationships, right? Because in romantic relationships, we are fundamentally getting into that because we want to derive some level of benefit. The feeling of getting love itself is a benefit that you derive from that relationship, which is why we choose to be with certain people over other people. If assuming it's true that we can derive the same benefit, why not everyone just date each other, right? And that benefit, insofar as it is not stated upfront, it has to then be construed, and then the idea just becomes about pure vibe. But we posit to you that even the idea of vibe and raw emotional affection is still largely derived on what you can get out of that other partner. Insofar as you're unable to derive a significant amount of love that is through your idea of what you value from your partner being giving to you, you're not able to vibe with them at its most purest form. And I think the idea here is important to note here that while this is not stated upfront, it already exists in status quo as an expectation. But most importantly, it doesn't allow people to be upfront within the relationships because of this taboo. These expectations will fundamentally exist over time, no matter what. But second argument that why transactionality and the discussion of it minimizes relationships falling apart right from the beginning. I think firstly, the idea here is that terms and conditions are just stated much more clearly. We are upfront in things like dating culture when it comes to what are green flags, what are boundaries. All of these things are stated upfront with your partner. You get the expectations of what the other party is. You also know what it is that you desire, and your partner also knows what it is that you are okay with. I'm unclear as to why you're not able to do the same things with transactionality. I think this can happen in the past in different times where, in the past where in which there's no social media, there's little sharing, people are the idea of transactionality and just not talking about relationships probably can survive because there's not much discussion as a whole. But in the age of the social media era, there's an amalgamation of culture and principles, and people believe in different ideas. There's a diversity in principles, and a diversity in expectations, and people have recognized that idea as individuals themselves. So trying to suppress individuals from being able to express what they want out of their partners is fundamentally harmful and it's repressive individuals. But I think secondarily, This then eventually leads up to things like lesser fights because of the fact that you can get those better matches in the beginning, right? This leads to just reducing the guessing game over a long period of time, reducing the fights that lead to a toll on your relationship and straining that relationship over the decades that were to come. Right? Because we also know that, again, that there's an asymmetrical power system within the relationship, right? Where one will end up being stronger and the other person has to end up giving in. And the other person, either one has to then subdue their expectation, has to subdue their expectation, which then becomes incredibly unfair to the partner. We posit to you that this then leads to a large amount of resentment. In our world, assuming that you were to be transactional, you say it as it is, you say what you want, and the point in which they don't meet that expectation, you're fine with calling it out. Then thirdly, this then enables people to be able to exit at any point. If they're not holding up their end of the bargain, you can bring it up and confront them. We think this should be the case across all relationships for the sake of transactionality. If people are not fitting your idea of what a green flag is, we call it all the time. I'm unclear why you can't do the same here. We talk about all kinds of things like boundaries, sexual kinks, and etc. Why not talk about this, right? But fourthly, the idea of that just being more recourse for you. I'm sorry. And the fact that the other party not saying anything. Do you really want to continue meeting this? Do you really want to continue meeting these expectations, or do you want to just end the relationship? I think not being able to speak about these things is harmful in the long run. But thirdly, why exactly this argument fitting in the status quo and why it can be applied? A couple of things here. Firstly, the fact that there are myriad of opinions already existing in status quo, and you just have to be honest, right? Or people already being honest, right? I think the idea here that employers are incredibly honest, like relatively more honest about wages, and employees within companies are discussing things like their wages amongst each other. This allows you to then bargain for better wages because of the fact that you recognize that you've been giving so much slow work. I think secondarily, parents, in the cases where in which you feel that your parents are wronging you and not giving you sufficient affection, not giving you sufficient care, you're able to call them out and bring them up to the fact that I'm not getting my value out of you as a parent. I think you can do the same things when it comes to relationships and you not being able to get that value out of your partner. But secondarily, people have these things in their brains innately, right? We're just expressing these feelings. People just don't talk about it because of the stigma. The ocean itself recognizes it to a certain extent. I think on our side, we empower people to be able to look for that, like look for those conversations. But thirdly, we think transactionality and the receiving of gifts and receiving of things is love in and of itself. Having someone to talk to you about what you want and what you expect is a recognition of love. And secondarily, giving something and getting something in exchange, the recognition of your passion and your commitment to the relationship. These are all things that are part of the loving system, loving relationship. All the reasons start with working. I'm out of this one. Sorry, my speech. Really cool. Two pieces of setup then before I quick engage, but two arguments on the positive. The first is why the nature of transactional relationships are bad. The second is why you provide produce more meaningful relationships on the outside house. The first piece of setup is on why the stigmatization is likely to be done well, which directly engages with a large proportion of OG's case. The first is that a lot of relationship advice, a lot of relationship norms discuss the behavior without attaching it directly to the people. So it isn't directly name dropping the people or directly attaching in all of these things to the people. We're discussing about their behaviors, discussing about their characteristics. This is because the people and the groups who spread the narrative in of itself have the incentive to do so. They don't want to be harsh with people the most because they want people to participate in their discussions. So in return, they want the most buy-in as possible. They are unlikely to be harsh. The second piece here is that when you we will highlight the positive examples of relationships without transactional examples. So things like parents caring for children naturally, for example, so people can have a better contextualization of what it means, what a relationship that exists without a transactional relationship. But also the groups want to do so because they want to highlight the root causes so people can form meaningful discussion and form examples of how to do so. This is like the Facebook groups, for example, that creates meaningful discussions for people to opt different types of relationships. The bottom line of this is that there's probably no expectation for the additional benefits the relationship gets. The second piece of framing, I don't just quickly frame out a lot and push to cut because the abusive relationships will exist for both sex classes regardless. This debate is much more moderate, much more average types of relationships. Relationships. Also, a quick piece of engagement, which is about the point of relationship. There are three things on engagement. The first is to explain why
most transactional relationships are coercive in nature. Like it's male justifying sex for females because they seem to have more power. People who have much more economical capacity means they can justify transactional relationships on the people who probably don't. Comparative is become makes people much more aware of it under our side because even if people themselves internally aren't aware, because of the stigmatization and the discussions that you form meaningfully under our side because the friends around the people can call them out about the relationships we form. The second piece of engagement is that it's actually about how you cannot buy with your peers firm. I like the fact a lot of the mechanisms that Divvesh talks about, the green flags and red flags, for example, exist under both sets of houses because you want to prevent toxic relationships. So if you like to avoid red flags in general, for example, but also in general, people want to opt into relationships and expect it to last long, So people just generally want to get together with people with similar interests or people who just vibe with them generally. So I like to do so under both sets of houses. What they have to defend are materialistic forms of like benefits. It wasn't about green flags and red flags. The last one I talked about is came about transparency. The motion talks about personal relationships. So it's a natural incentive for people to create discussions about transparency about personal relationships under both sides of others, because for the very same incentives for people to avoid toxic relationships anyways. Onto the first claim on why transactional relationships are just off them back. There are two claims that are made under this. The first, it is based on what individuals on the ground provide and expecting what they get in return. So this is like a rational exchange of benefits. What this means is that privileged people, the male, the rich people, people who are much more beautiful in general, have priority over this because people just generally want to make friends with them, insofar as they can give much more materialistic forms of benefits. The second is that on the flip, a lot of minorities are shut out. People who have disabilities, people who just are generally socio-economically poor, for example, because the capability for them to give out a lot, much more in the transactional relationships is just marginally less. So people don't expect a lot from them. What are the impacts on this? Twofold. Before said, maybe you have these political issues or social economic issues under both sides of the house. What changes is an entrenched flow under the other side of the house, where the rich get richer and they can just basically access into much more relationships with richer people, or when you discriminate and isolate poor people or people with disabilities. The second thing is that people who are the most vulnerable need these types of relationships because these are ones that are isolated by the societal structures we live in. So this means that the relationships that they need to form means that they need these types of love the most. But also, each of the relationships they enter is that you give them an internal form of pressure. They are always asking themselves as to whether or not they have given the expectation that the other party have given. The bottom line under this is that either these forms of minorities don't opt into any relationship at all because people just generally isolate them, or if they, in the event that they opt into relationships, which is the best case of that, they expect a lot of pressure, they put a lot of expectation onto themselves to give much more within a relationship. Onto the second tip on why we have much more meaningful relationships under our side of us. Before that, any of you want? Closing? Oh, yeah. So you can say transactional issues are all is it up to the dating market or people to decide that you guys? Yeah, you still have discussions. Yeah. I don't really understand that. Okay. Onto the claim on how you have more meaningful relationships. I want to first discuss who are the groups of people that can define what transactional relationships are. We would suggest that it is mainstream people. It is people who have much more power. It is people who have political capacity. This means that if these people have power, they will try to use these different types of metrics to justify the abusiveness of their relationships. This is the house breadwinners, the males, for example, justifying the whole entire relationship as a transactional relationship when they demand sex from the other party, which is like the women. Why do all of these changes under our side of the house? The first that you can call out easily about problematic laws on their side of the house because you can implicitly agree within these contracts because it is framed as a transactional relationship. This means that even problematic laws will exist. The ability for you to call out these laws becomes much more harder under their side of the house. The second is that it is still if it is uncertain, if the relationship as a whole is just uncertain, given that you don't expect anything out of the relationship, you just generally try to build more about the relationship because you people on the ground just have incentives to have the relationship last long. So you don't expect what you want. Only comparative, but it's just purely based on transactionality. You will think that the other party is continuously doing less. when you can like you probably don't see a lot about their sacrifices. So you expect much so you have way higher expectations of them, which harms your relationship onto them. Similarly, that applies to you, because people don't see your contributions within the relationship. So people actively undermine your contribution, which just generally makes the relationship as a whole much worse. What are the impacts under this? Given that it's a relationship debate, I think both sex houses will agree that meaningful relationships must occur in most trusted relationships. Given that we explain why transactional relationships often come this when people expect much more from the other party, for all of these reasons, oppose.
I think OO got it right when they say that we need to have discussions. Unfortunately, you can only have discussions when they're negotiating tables. We provide the tables in open government. How should this debate be weighed out? This debate has been weighed out on two measures. One is on transparency and accountability, i.e., a lot of such relationships turn sour because partners don't speak about what they actually expect, but at the same time, they are secretly expecting something, hoping that the other party will get it right. We think rather than resorting to this sort of disengagement, I think Prime Minister rightfully pointed out, there's a lot of negative emotional trauma that can fall as a result of that. We would rather be upfront, even if it seems a bit crude according to what opening opposition say. But number two, we think that we are also going to say that this is not something that's completely out of the blue or something too radical, because it is something that is already practiced across all sorts of society. We talk about from a very young age, you are told that if you don't like something, you have to tell your parents that you don't want to do something. Even for example, when you work, the reason why we have more wage transparency now is to give power towards employees to then say that for this work that I'm doing, I demand X amount of money. I think every single facet of society has already moved towards more transparency and more transactionality. I think it's time the relationship follow that. Insofar as opening opposition want a meaningful relationship, but does not give you reasons as to why that meaningful relationship is less toxic, which I want to point out is a blanket term, and toxicity is depending on the party that opts into that relationship. We are going to have lesser guessing room of what toxic is, and we're going to allow toxic people to stay together, non-toxic people to one another. Now, before we move on into my three forms of extension, I'm going to give you two responses. The first is that they say that this debate is not about abusive relationships, this debate is about modern relationships. But we are saying that this is not just about physical abuse. A lot of times, some kind of open government that they guessing of what the other party expects, or you not be able to tell upfront is toxic in of itself, because these individuals clearly have needs that they want to be met. But at the same time, any sort of attempt for them to voice out will be seen as, oh, you're being too demanding, oh, you're being too calculating. We think that forces this individual to put their happiness at the pedestal lower than that of their partners, and having to constantly second guess themselves, even though a lot of their needs are completely legitimate. They say that we're going to allow richer individuals to have an advantage. That's not true, because while agree that financial transactions can be part of this relationship, transactionality as what we clearly define, and no reason for opposition to provide why that's going to be as such, can be on a myriad form of transactionality. For example, I can be rich and I can give you money to buy clothes, or I can take very good pictures, or I cook very good food, or for example, I can give you emotional support because I don't mind staying together at your side, even though some people clearly can't stand like being at their partner's house for more than 4 hours. All of this means that what we are saying is that every single individual has different ways of receiving and giving love, and every single love language is different, but we allow people to bring those terms and conditions to the table for them to at least state what it is. It is only toxic and open opposition because they're constantly told that their needs should be placated in order to meet another individual. We don't think that financial transaction is bad, because we think that in some communities it is actually good for them to be so upfront. For example, the African American community in, like for example, New York is completely upfront. A lot of them are completely fine being the side home if it means that they can actually get a car, they can actually get checks. They are completely fine. And we think that's a healthy relationship they have, because at least they're upfront and they're able to provide sex and companionship in return for money. We don't see a reason as to why opposition is saying that's bad, because these things will happen regardless. Even if you don't say it, then by default, these individuals with money will think that they can get away with it. Only on our side, we make transactionality a thing. Can the individual be say that I don't care about your money, I want more money, can you give it to me? If not, I'm going to move elsewhere. We think this sort of power asymmetry would exist on both sides. We tend to equalize it much better. Insofar as opposition recognizes the problem, but don't tell me how relationship will be better on their side, they cannot take this debate.
Now, moving on to arguments. The first of prevention of exploitation, there are three things I want to point out here. One is power asymmetry, and I think this directly tackles what opening officers to talk about. They say that certain individuals have power asymmetry over the other. We completely agree. But a lot of times, if terms and conditions are not said upfront and transactionality is not met, it means that the person that holds more natural power asymmetry already, then they get away with their demands. This means that, for example, the richer individual, the dato, or for example, the person who is much older because somehow age equates to wiseness, then this person will be able, wisdom, this person will be able to get away because they will always say that the person that's on the other side is wrong, rather than you not meeting the terms and conditions. On our side, I think what Divvesh say is that individuals' needs can change, but at least their needs are met and the needs are stated upfront. So there's lesser exploitation because there's no disagreement as to why a person should listen to another person on default, rather than just reverting towards what the document says, the figurative document. Number two, gaslighting. A lot of times individuals will be gaslighting and say that, oh, I already met a demand. What do you mean? Why are you saying this? Like, why are you being so needy? That happens because another person is not clearly upfront about what they want, means that they leave room for interpretation about what their needs actually are, which also gives leeway towards like shitty partners to get away with things because they can constantly say that, oh, I already met you, I didn't lie to you, I was actually returning your text. So we think that all of those things can be stated upfront, and transactionality is good because you want this individual to say that I am able to give you XYZ. But the only one thing I demand is that you don't lie to me. If a person is unable to meet that, then don't enter into a relationship or find someone that's okay with you lying. I think all these form of things, when it's directly, clearly upfront, is able to prevent gaslighting. But more often than not, even if you enter into the best intention, and even if the partner is not abusive, there is a lot of second guessing on part of the person who happens to be the weaker one in the relationship, meaning they're constantly saying that, oh, maybe what I'm doing is not enough, maybe it's my fault, rather than reverting back to what was the negotiation, or actually allowing them the ability to bring that up to their partner without fear of judgment. And I think that's a good enough benefit that's not speculative in any sense, because even if the mere talk itself is better, we think that we could provide you that platform to have that talk. But two, alignment with modern economic and social realities. Why is this better and how should this be rated? If we can tell you that this is something that's already practiced elsewhere, then we think that it's aligned and it will be practiced widely, and that stigmatization falls. One, transactionality is inescapable because I've already alluded to you earlier that people do this in all facets of society already, meaning that people expect something when they give something. So we think that's great. But two, you explore different modes of transactionality, because now, if, for example, it is true on their side that some people really, they don't have the beauty privilege, they don't have the financial privilege, but if they can actually then be able to voice out what they can bring to the table, at least a person will listen to them, correct? Because the person will say that, okay, this person clearly is not there for the looks, but I can perhaps get something from them. Maybe they are very, very good cook. So I think that is great because it gives a person that otherwise will be better upon their normative structures that they talk about, the ability to get a chance of voicing what they can bring to the other person, and I think that's great. But thirdly, informed consent. We think the relationship is all about consent. If we value consent in all forms of relationship, or all aspects of relationship, I'm unsure as to why you can't do that to begin with. We think that the starting of the relationship needs to be one where consent is the most practiced, because you need to tell the other person what you're entering into. If the other person is unable to meet necessarily what your form of transaction is, they should not enter a relationship. So we think that there's a lot of exploration in status quo about different forms of relationship models. We have the ancient avoidant relationship model, we have love languages, we have Maya-based. All of those things are practiced widely. I'm unsure as to why transactionality is something that is so stigmatized in status quo. Based on those regards, opening government is proud to win.
Two questions. First, who benefits from transactionality? Second, how people perceive their contributions in transactional relationships. First, on who benefits from transactionality. Opening government's claim is transparency is good because you write these things down or at least talk about it. There are a couple of reasons why this is an inexclusive claim in the debate. One is that you still discuss your long-term plans in a non-transactional relationship because it helps you plan things like your marriage timelines, like when you want to break it up in cases where this isn't able to work. And the structural reason why this is true, and it does not depend on you making it transactional, is because it doesn't actually require both sides to be able to fulfill them. What does this mean? It means that if you discuss that I, for instance, cannot be in a marriage right now because of religious norms, that doesn't depend on what the other person's contribution is. It just matters what you are giving into the relationship. On their side, you discuss your contributions from the framework of what they can give back. And that's where the difference in the debate is, because obviously people want to self-preserve by explaining that
this is how I want to enter the relationship, this is what I can contribute. But on the other side, you'll always view it relative to what the other person can contribute, which is why you become more cold and calculating. Secondly, even without transparency, people default to more kindness and more goodness because you want to make yourself more appealing. In uncertainty, where it's not clear what's going to happen to you, you want to make yourself as insulated as possible from the case of the other person losing love in you, which is why people go over the top. Finally, the reason why expectations are not transactional is because transactionality requires you to make those things clear, but those things can also change over time, right? Because if their case is that you're writing it down from the very get-go and you have to stick to that, why would you want to amend the terms of your transaction? Because that seems to be changing from what we initially agreed on. So you have to explain whether you want this to be set in stone or don't want this to be set in stone. Next, open government incorrectly assumes that without transactionality, people are left completely in the blur. This explains why it's not true. Finally, what is our take on this one? We think that their side necessarily entrenches inequality because they say transactions can value you for other things like your cooking skills and whatnot. It's never clear that these are the things that will be valued more than other things that society values, right? Like the age, hierarchy, greater power in terms of beauty standards or greater power in terms of financial contributions. This looks like parents investing in the most intelligent children. On the other side, the best children receive the most attention and resources because they are seen as the most valuable. They're best able to pay for their parents when they retire in the long term. But on our side, parents do this less because they have been criticized for it. Because you say you must love all children equally, regardless of whether they can help fulfill one end of a transaction. They say people can be a side here. That's fine for people who want to be side posts, but obviously many people will be locked out as a result of this, right? And you can provide one thing in a relationship. But the problem there is it's very limited in terms of your scope. People are always very calculating of what do we view your value to be? And when people themselves view that my only value is a side post, that's when you prevent yourself from going any further. People always view less and less of themselves. And if we accept that these are minorities, it's never clear why you will have bargaining power because society entrenches the idea that that is all they have to value, which becomes infinitely worse for these people. Waiting, not everyone is able to give good contributions all the time. Some people may have times of sickness, but for other people it's worse because you view their disability as a permanent obstacle to be able to give back. These people are never valued, their contributions are seen as less. Closing government says as an open market of relationships, but they have to prove that that is likely. Conventionally valued traits will always be valued on both sides, and now these people are seen as giving less. On our side, there's a reason why people are friends with those that can't immediately give them back, because we view friendship, we view relationships as something more, something special to people, that we can in fact do a lot of stuff. It may be irrational, but that's the point. A lot of things in life with regards to love is inherently irrational. But when you try to make it completely rational, that's when people become cold, they become calculating. You always measure people's value of what you can give to them, or what they can give to you, rather than what you give to them. The second part of this, it just makes relationships worse. It gives people existential dread. Conventionally attractive people now enter relationships not knowing who are their true friends and who are the people that are only being friends with me because I'm conventionally attractive and want to use me as a sex thing in the future. On our side, there's more self-esteem and confidence in your relationships. That's why we stigmatize simply using people for what they can give to you. People are more likely to be friends and have relationships with others, even if you don't see your immediate productive value as very large. Finally, there are a lot of people who currently right now aren't able to give lots of value, but in the future can be good partners. For example, people who are starting up their own businesses, now they may see it as a failing, but in many years' time, they can in fact provide you that value. The problem on the other side is you always judge people on the basis of who they are now, and for many people, those people are completely disadvantaged in terms of the relationships. So maybe they make things clear. Maybe you make those relationships have a very clear set of contracts. But my point is that they never get the contract in the first place because you view them as less worthy of being able to fulfill these contributions. Second, how do people perceive contributions in transactional relationships? This takes guts at your best. Even if you have a perfect discussion of expectations, it doesn't mean people believe those expectations are being fulfilled in the correct ways. Because you shift their mindset to become more skeptical of the other person. It's always about what can they give back to me? And the problem is that people have a preconception that what they give is always more important than what the other person gives to them. So, for example, the workplace is a terrible example for the other side because it's precisely the workplace where employees always feel, I'm giving so much to my workplace, the workplace doesn't give anything back to me. Even in cases where the workplace actually invest in their development, actually invest in creating them a safe social space. People always judge others because you don't know their story. You can't see the blood, sweat, tears that they're putting behind the scenes, they're sacrificing. You always view as your giving back to the relationship is more virtuous than theirs. your sacrifice is always greater than theirs, which is why on their side, even if you're meeting the standards of that you initially discussed, most people always think the other person is failing because they never truly see what goes on to those contributions. The impact of this is that men will feel like their monetary contribution is a more important part of the transaction than the woman's contribution of household chores and raising children. As opposed to on our side, the default is that doing beyond what's expected of you is encouraged. On the other side, doing beyond what's expected of you is stigmatized and seen as a waste of time. Yes.
Yeah, in your world whereby negotiations are not commonplace and people feel scared to actually tell the other partner what they want, how will you restore context on your end?
No, I still think they will be able to talk about what they want, except the frame is not, I am giving you this in expectation that you will give me this. Because in every case, I've explained to you now, why people always deem their own contributions as less worthy, so as more worthy, and the other person's contribution as less worthy. So you always feel like, I'm putting in more than the other person, and as a result, I am wrong. You always demand more of your partner. That's why when the other side says there are social inequalities, I agree. But the problem is that the man will always have the upper hand in saying that the woman gave less to me. And if the woman feels that way, they don't have that same leverage because they are socialized to believe that women need to give back more. As opposed to the man who believes that this is something that's unfair, that my contribution is greater than the other person. So what does this do for the debate? God eventually say that we talk about the terms and conditions, but they have to explain why people view the fulfillment of such terms and conditions in a fair way. But most people have skepticism. Most people are cold and calculating when they view other people's transactions and how whether they're fulfilling them, which means most people think the other person has failed. Most people become more rational and see these relationships as vehicles for productivity, as long-term investment. Lots of people who are vulnerable, who need relationships and friends the most, are locked out of them, and those who are in relationships always feel tense because they don't know what to expect the other person. For those reasons, of course.
Am I audible and visible? This is that bit today. Never gets old, unlike me. Okay. Closing government will enter this debate by acknowledging that opening government did the counterfactual part of the debate by saying, like, we don't like the stigmatization of transactionality, and like this are counterfactual, but they never told us what was exactly the harm of like why did we rent it so much in the first place? We're gonna come in, we're gonna provide like the bulk of that, and I'll talk a little bit about abusive behavior. But secondly, I think what's interesting in opening half is that there's a discussion a lot about interpersonal relationships, like the transactionality as it applies to people. We'll talk a little bit about how the idea of transactionality actually leads to more introspection and more of a reassessment of self and your individual value, and how that empowers people to get out of like terrible situation to self-improvement. And that's far more likely in a world in which transactionality is not stigmatized as the one that it is. I have three rebuttals to make. Firstly, is this point that Umar made that transactional relationship, is it set in stone or is it not? Guys, business relationships and transactional relationships are reassessed all the time. That's why, like, even in business relationships, we have quarterly reports, we have annual reports. That's what anniversaries are for us to see where we are. Are we happy with this relationship? And what have we brought? What have you brought? What is our future together like? So we don't understand that point. Secondly, is the idea of this burden push they have on us to prove that the open market is fair. And I think that actually leads to, we don't have to, we don't think it is, but I think being honest and upfront is mutually beneficial for all parties involved. You save opportunity cost. You don't have to waste time trying to figure out if we're right for each other, trying to discover what they know. And of course, we don't necessarily agree that you have to put things up front, right, in your profile that I like these things. We think people can also discover that at the time, but it should be as quick as possible to kind of offer these things up so that people get to find, because there are billions of us out there. Obviously, if you build this idea of one soulmate, you need to get through them, right? You can't just spend time on the people that you're not right for. Lastly, is this weird idea that workplace, like workplace is like transactional stuff is bad for work. They try to say the analogy doesn't work. But we think the argument, and I think the argument that OO is saying is that, look, people end up in bad deals, right? People end up in bad transactions all the time. But I think we have to ask ourselves at the end of this debate, is where in what kind of situation would people be more likely to climb out or get out of bad leads? One in which they have an idea for why this is bad, or one in which they have no idea, where it's opaque, right? Where you don't have any idea for who holds, or you have some idea who holds it, but you have no bargaining power yourself because you don't know how much you bring to the table, how much you're worth at the end of the day. How do you quantify what a bad deal is unless you have data? Right, so I think that's something that, like I think, LO was right to say that we need to have a discussion, but discussions can only start from a starting point and with evidence. Right, so the first idea of the harms of stigmatizing transactionality, I think OG kind of skips over this. We think what happened was there was a status quo, there was a trend towards introspection and accountability. That's why you had the Me Too movement and holding men accountable for what they do to women. Right, but then there was a backlash against it. Right, this idea of like, oh, we don't like friends with benefits, we don't like that because the idea is you're taking, I think. OG does mention it somewhere, right? Takes the romance out of it, we took off dating. Well, I think the counterbalance that, or the stigmatization led to an empowerment of like a YOLO culture, living life in the moment, and believing this idea that ignorance is bliss. We don't need to know how this relationship is. Like, don't think too much about what the relationship is. What it does is it stigmatizes accountability, self-improvement, and introspection, which we think are keys to growth. Okay, but more importantly, and this is what's key to this is it empowers exploiters and abusers because they function best when people don't know what they're in for. When people don't know they're being screwed out of this situation. That's why the workplace analogy is very apt. Employers work best when employees don't know how much they're making relative to one another. Right? That's a situation in which they're able to exploit the asymmetry of information and the fact that people don't have access to that information to make sure that other people are being exploited. Let me just point out that humans may not know exactly what justice is for everyone, but we all have an innate and visceral sense of injustice. And this is what enables and motivates us. And that actually leads to the second part of my extension, just accountability and self-evaluation. Part of what transactionality requires you to do is not just to hold someone else accountable, but obviously there is a dialogue. They'll also be like, well, what are you doing? And so this forces the person who is part of this transactional, like it doesn't have to be one-on-one. Like I know people in poly relationship groupos, right? Like this forces everyone to be like, hi, like this is what I bring, right? Not just material, but I bring affection, I bring all these kind of things I do for you, whether it's service, like Patrick just mentioned, love language. It doesn't matter what the details are, but what's important is it makes people look inside and see what they are. And I think what's very interesting, this is an engagement to what Umar talked about in terms of minorities and disadvantaged people. If you only with transactionality can the minorities and disadvantaged people see how much or how little they're worth in society compared to everyone else. That only happens if you have that method or something to provoke them to look inwards. Now, you might ask, okay, but what happens next? Well, there are two ways of them looking at it. They can either believe in the idea of self-improvement and be able to improve themselves, right? Or secondly, and what's more likely is they're able to systemic and societal barriers that hold it up against them. This enrages them. This galvanizes them to do whatever they can to either improve the lot for themselves or for others like that. That really happens in transactional relations when people realize how little society values them as individuals, as the romantic partners as a whole. What does this also do? Sure, yeah.
So if society introspects and realizes that minorities are actually worth very little, why would someone go above and beyond to care for them when you say that that's an irrational thing to do because it's not fair to them?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that the second half?
So minorities realize they're worth very little.
Yeah.
Why would society go above and beyond to help them if it's not fair?
I don't think it's dependent on other people. I think at the end of the day, minorities don't have to derive value from what, and of course, knowing how little other people view them is a good starting point. But then they can decide to be like, I don't need them to determine how I value or how I see myself, right? And I think that's one of the most important parts here. When you start empowering people who are low self-esteem, who are disadvantaged, to see themselves as greater than what other people see them as, it motivates them to self-improve, right? It gives them agency, which isn't available under these systemic barriers. Even if they might argue it's a false illusion, right? But the idea is it gives them the power to believe that they're able to change things within themselves. What is important then in this debate is not just you look at transactionality, simply something that what we do within relationships, but it's to recognize that transactionality requires us and enables us to see not only what we do for other people, right, but what they mean to us as well. And what can we do to change about our lives? What people in relationships? Sometimes people are stuck in relationships because of inertia, because of old time's sake. And we think that's terrible when people are stuck in lovely relationships for decades just because of the children. We think that at the end of the day, if you're stuck in these relationships, you should assess, why am I still here? What do I bring? And can I be better off elsewhere? Thank you.
The stream of logic not going on. I think this debate really explains what's the point of a stigma. Stigma exists to correct the worst desires in humanity. Because we, as human beings, have a natural inclination to be selfish, to want more, to expect more constantly, every single time we have a conversation with our partner. And this makes love impossible to access because we always want more from our partner. Stigma is a counter narrative that corrects the worst human desires to say that your love is unconditional. Even if I can't cook anymore because I broke my hand, even if I lose my job, I am still worthy of love. OG and CG lock people out of love simply because they cannot be as stable as the pillars of capitalism. I'll give you one extension on the necessity to stigmatize and a list of harms as to why the OG case actually exists because of a trend to destigmatize, which flips the entire OG case. Before that, some pieces of clarification. Let's answer the question, can or will people tell each other their expectations before coming into a relationship? Because OG seems to think people don't do that already, although analyzing in context that people already do that. I think we all agree that people already tell each other the expectations. This is with or without the stigmatization. Because number one, people generally have an aversion to shock because we don't want to be blindsided in the future. But secondly, we have a natural tendency to be stable, right? We want to know what's going to happen in the future, whether you have a job. We're not making decisions based on whether you have a job or not. We just want to know. If OG and CG's best benefit is data, just talk to each other because that's literally a bloody relationship. You can't possibly tell me the comparative is not going to talk to each other at all. What am I proving here? I'm proving that we can always tell each other our deal breakers. This minimizes the first half of the CG case, but also showing that data is not exclusive to only Gov bench. Let's deal with OG. OG seems to think that there's a contract that people have to make and key in their preferences early on. The first question I want to ask is, how will we know what are your preferences? And we just argue that the comparative is quite impossible because number one, nobody really knows what we want. But secondly, we don't know what happens in the future. And this is the problem. A relationship doesn't stop the moment you enter a relationship. A relationship is for the rest of your life, at least in the hopes for it being the rest of your life. We're arguing that when life does happen, when you inevitably will lose a job, or when you inevitably will lose a leg because of bad Malaysian healthcare habits, we will think that these people are going to always be ostracized, locked away from relationships in the worst case. But secondly, what would happen on OG and CG is that they will rely on the worst possible metrics for these desires. And this is why capitalism informs most of our decisions. That will also be a part of the extension. Our corporate capitalism is all-encompassing, and literally every single desire that you have is because of influences around you, or you see in the media, or you see in advertising. And this literally makes it impossible for us to get any level of love if you don't comply with the standards of capitalism. Extension then, but there's the necessity to stigmatize. I already said that stigma exists to correct the worst human desires. we already have a natural inclination to be selfish. We care for what's good for me. Even in fights, in status quo, when people argue with their partners, it's I'm saying this, but do you understand my point of view? What do I get out of this? We think that makes things worse on your side of the house because selfishness will take a front seat and will drive more and more relationships. Without the stigma, you descend into these things. What are the harms? First, it gives permission to weaponize the power of asymmetry. When you enter into a relationship, a man will always have more social capital than a woman. On OG, they will say, oh, you entered this relationship. So whenever and if you can't bring things to the table, it's on you. You are the person that entered this relationship. You are the person that didn't key in your preferences early enough. This is literally victim blaming that makes it impossible for women even to access the best and meaningful relationships. Secondly, there's an ever-escalating demand for more. So CG will say there will be annual reports, but CG is also the team that says that we want to stick with these people, right? We don't think people are going to stick with these individuals to the point in which we fall below the standard of this annual report. That means at any point you don't have the things that you initially promised you have, you will be locked out of a relationship, you literally be forced to break up. We just don't think that human beings act like this because in that relationship, you'll obviously create bonds. It really like connection that you would ever, you don't ever want to lose. That literally, you're literally making it impossible for them to ever access this relationship. The human harm here is that we become more demanding. We constantly want more and more from each other. There is no end because an informed choice is impossible because you don't know what your desires are. But thirdly, and it's crucial, you're always looking over your shoulder every time in that relationship. Maybe I'll lose my job. Maybe I'll be unemployed. And that means that you will never really get the most meaningful relationship because if I don't do well in this job, I'm going to be locked out from that relationship. My wife is going to hate me and going to leave me. We really don't think that human beings should act like this because that makes it really impossible for them to ever find meaning. You're not really loving your wife, you're loving your job in order to love your wife. That's literally putting a barrier to accessing this love. Yes, Woody.
OG clearly analyzed the transactionality, allowing people to clearly state being emotional and terminate relationship if their terms are not met. If people clearly have leave where we check or judge if they voice out in your work, why would there be a safe space to voice out for them?
Okay, on the safe space thing, right? I don't think there will be a safe space because of the existing power symmetry. So we agree that men probably hold the most capital in this world, but the same men are going to enter that relationship. In this relationship, the woman is always going to be off on the back foot. In a transactional relationship, the man will say, you consented to this relationship because I already said the terms of my agreement much early on. So the reason why it means you're falling below the standard here. That's problematic. The comparative is here simple. We get unconditional love, and I think that should be the standard because the stigmatization will lead to more and more of this. Number one, even if less people have real relationships, we think that they'll be more meaningful because you go in knee deep together, you make decisions together. You don't go and enter a relationship and buy a house and say, this is on the condition that you will, like, if you ever lose your job, we're gonna just default on this loan. We work things together, even if it comes to the worst possible cases. This way it has to be judged on what could possibly go wrong. And in love, it allows us to stop things from going on, making things, even if they go wrong, it's still better for all those who speak.
The reason why yearly assessments are important, so that you have something to say with the AGM. Otherwise, it's just people looking at each other and then you have nothing So I think I want to first separate the opening and the closing government, right? Yeah, the opening and the closing government. So opening government is more extreme and they also take on higher burdens. They explain on why is it such that having this norm, albeit I think that they could have done better in explaining why this norm is likely to exist in the first place. Because I think in a regrets motion, you still have to build the counterfactual significantly. They kind of rely a lot on the fact that you can import corporate and like society market logic into personal relationships. Often that isn't really the case. Yeah, I already debated that in round one. I don't really want to rehash my own speeches. So next, I want to deal specifically with closing opposition first, because I think that's for reasons. So first, they say that stigma exists to correct human problems. So okay, Syakir does explain why stigmatization is important. But the important part of the debate is not necessarily why stigmatization, but rather why is transactionality bad, which I don't think it necessarily does. So even if I were to rely on the absolute worst case, where he points out, and this also applies to what opening opposition said, that you will have a very asymmetrical relationship where the dominant party is able to invoke transactionality. And even if that is the worst case, through perhaps extension on introspection and understanding what you are able to bring to the table, this is where you understand. Because as humans, we might not know what justice is. We might not know what is fair for us, but we definitely know what is unfair, right? When you know that a person has asymmetrical power over you and is constantly demanding these things without necessarily giving back, at some point, through our framework, will you be able to say, yeah, this is too much, I'm out, right? And I think this is what differentiates us more clearly. Opening government is like, whenever you get into a relationship, you have to be clear, you have to, all the cards on the table. That's something I know a lot. Oh, but also, like, but on our side, what is more important is what we think is a prerequisite to that, right? Because in order for you to understand, like, what you bring to the table and what you're able to like negotiate for, it requires you to understand within yourself what is worth and what do you consider worth in what you want. So now I'm going to go more into detail into why we win over opening. And like I think my main criticism of Fuji is that they're extremely optimistic, which is a bad thing. Because they also, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they make a lot of assumptions. And I think I already pointed out just now that the adoption of a norm somewhere doesn't mean that you can instantly replicate it everywhere else, that individuals are likely going to be okay with you being extremely transactional. I think this is what Umar, this is what Owen talks about. And like that's, I'm also going to deal with it later. But also, if it's a given, like they take it as a given that transactionality will be received well in society. So they have like a high benefit because now a lot of people are going to be okay with negotiating, relationships are going to be more straightforward. But the problem is that there's also a higher burden that they have to prove and why this is going to happen in the first place. But also this is what Owen says in the response is that there's going to be a lack of perceived warmth in this relationship. I think closing also says this, that like, we normally want in a relationship to be the other person, not a replaceable cog in a machine. I think this is generally true, right? And this is also where we come in. Because we don't tell you that relationships must be 100% of you, I give you what, you give me what, but rather a discovery of what you're able to give and what you actually want. And this goes into my second problem with OG, because they sort of assume that people have the perfect understanding of what they want and what they can give. When in truth, we don't really know, right? We don't really know what we want in relationships. Like one day we want, okay, never mind, there's kids. Okay. Now, lastly, we also don't engage with the downsides. Okay, so now I'm going to deal with like O's case. So O says that privileged individuals have a lot of capital, that they have societal factors that are like favor them, and that this is why relationships are going to ultimately favor them. And you create an environment for calculating relationships that's generally worse. Well, I think it's generally true. It also assumes that individuals are unaware of bad relationships that they can be. So it's true that if you have no other choice, like if you have no other choice for a boyfriend, you will choose the one that is like not that, right? But if that is the case, on our side, you still are able to make that assessment of whether or not I am better off without a boyfriend. Right? And I think this is also generally true for a lot of reasons. And this is something that also deals with Syakir. So like they sort of assume that there is one information that people have are locked in on only getting one relationship, or that you really want like, you know, this one fella is like, you're right for that. When it's not really the case, right? And that people, there's also this like general statement that societal trends towards like similar attributes. So there will be some things that are very high in demand, some things that are lower in demand. But the truth is, they're still in demand, right? Like these are different attributes that might not be as highly valued if you like graph it out on a chart. But these are things that there are still a market for, and that there are still things that people accept and view as currency. Yeah.
So if a broke and depressed MPG addict sits in the mirror, he realizes they're not worth very much. So if people are not encouraged to go above and beyond for their friends, how?
Hey, can you ask a question?
So if people are not encouraged to go above and beyond for their friends, why would a person little value have friends?
Because like we don't like we told you, right? Like there are a lot of reasons for individuals to have friends. The problem is that if you don't conduct this routine assessment of what your relationship is, you often will lose more, and like you will also have relationships that basically go nowhere, right? So like I don't know, like, all my friends also losers who so I really don't know how to explain this one. Okay, now lastly, okay, yeah. No perfect information to also engage. Okay, so lastly, I think this is the important piece of engagement from that speech, that we also engage with the arguments that minorities will be boxed by societal expectations of them as a person, precisely because of the fact that this is the only way that they know how to view themselves. Actually, something that changes on our side because of one, what I mentioned previously. Individuals can have access to a lot of different information about how to view themselves. There's a lot of different streams, different types of empowerment on different flags. I think MDG is good, okay? And then and this also through the self-assessment mechanism means that you're able to find things that you value and you think that other people should value as well. That I've been proud of to propose. Yeah.
Love and access to relationships is something that people should experience in order to attain the launch back to personal growth, genuinity, healthy discourse, and the realization of happiness as an individual. The metric of relationships should not be materialistic and capitalistic transactionality, because people who cannot meet that standards will be inevitably locked out of the fact that they will never be able to access a relationship in the first place because of two things. Firstly, factors beyond your control, like generational poverty, birth lottery. But secondly, the kind of instability that you experience from like constant re-evaluations of what you want in a relationship will make you locked out of those standards. Proud to be the opposition to debate. Couple of things to do that. Firstly, just some quick reputations to the government whip in this debate before moving on to engagements with OG and the rest of the debate, right? They tell you that people already know what they want entering into a relationship. Two responses to this. Firstly, people cannot really conceptualize their desires. We don't really know what we want until we want it. Even then, it's probably conceded that there's some contradiction, which is that they even said it themselves, that they don't know what people want. But secondly, people will always want more. Even if they put a figure, at the end of the day, that figure will always change because there's such a capitalistic mindset that you will always want more. A house might not be enough for the future. That figure is not good enough. That kind of instability, the relationship that is contingent on that metric, means that if you don't meet the standards, you lose a partner at the end of the day. You suffer breakups. You go through a divorce, and that's so much trauma from the fact that you cannot fulfill that standard, that basic standard that is based on that relationship. We think that you should not experience all these kinds of problems and trauma. That's really bad. Why is this? Because relationships, the crux of it, the value of it is about safety. And we need safety in order to make people have a space to talk about what they feel, what they want. We think that is what a relationship should be. But moving on to clash and differentiation, right? Firstly, opening up. They bring two things to this debate. Firstly, they bring transparency. Second, talk about abuse and toxicity. Transparency, right? They bring transparency because people know exactly what they want. We already watched this. But we want to flip it into saying that transparency is not a benefit. We think that it will be a materialistic and tangible on transactionality because of the world that we live in as a capitalistic society. But secondly, it means that when you are transparent about what you want, based on the figure that that person will give you, you will always change your personal thoughts and your identity to that figure, which means that if that person is willingly enough to give you $100, if you perceive the world this way, then you would most likely change your identity to fit that person's expectations of you. You're willing to concede and compromise your identity, the liberal culture or your religion in order to fit into that person, because capital gives you agency and all those things. You destroy everything that you've ever lived for just for money. But secondly, on the extension that we have run in the member of opposition, that people cannot reach these expectations realistically. Poor people are locked out of relationships because they're the majority of the population that cannot fit those standards and cannot reach the metric, which means that they will not feel the extension of love in this debate. Yes.
Seems the question I hear is all should focus on resources on the same relevant things. Is unrealistic and blind love is probably just right in front of them.
Can you clarify that too?
Sometimes what you're seeing is that it's a closing up goal are poor people, give us agency and power right under the circumstances. What is the obligation to the world where there is no transaction?
Okay. Even if you give poor people some agency through relationships, we think it's already bad because of the second thing that you bring, right? Abuse and toxicity. You think that abuse and toxicity is fine because capital is so good, right? It gives you agency. You literally said that in your POI. But that also means because of the agency you get from capital, you're willing to concede on the fact that you are being abused and suffering toxicity from the partner, the relationship. Obviously, you care about victims of domestic abuse. You don't want that. Their own households. They don't have safe spaces in their own homes. Secondly, the social engineering that you support. People are more willing to adopt this narrative because obviously if people give you good things, that's already the right. You get agency, you get money, you get safety. The problem is that women cannot reach out. Women cannot speak out against the oppression when they suffer abuse in the first place. Agency does not matter if the condition is you suffering atrocities that you can't break out. Yes.
Abuse is more prevalent on your side because women are told to be patient and to even accept their partner wherever they are. In our world, we give women the agency to leave because their terms are not met. How do you deal with this?
We think that people already have the existing rationality that you will offer a relationship if it harms you because of the fact that person does not give you money in order to abuse you. But in your world, if you get money, abuse so much and people are willing to concede and compromise it because you can buy a house from a future, but you still get abused, which is pretty bad. Secondly, moving on to closing government, which they bring self-worth. They talk about what you can know how you are worth, right? What how do other individuals perceive you in your life? Are you better off in that relationship? Two responses. Firstly, you cannot use money to weigh your self-worth because it's a non-tangible concept, it's a very materialistic metric. Nothing can do your justice. Right? Your personal identity is not something that can put a figure on. It's something, even if you want self-worth so much, if your worth is $100 and people pay $200, does that mean that it's justified that they can abuse you and they can break your identity? Because that profit makes money so good and you get so much agency. It's pretty repetitive on their side. They didn't talk about agency and money. I think you've already watched that and felt that enough. But quickly moving on to opening opposition, which they talk about some access to love, right? Two responses to this. Firstly, you already recognize how people cannot attain love, how people are structurally locked out of it. And this transactionality means that only the rich, only the wealthy, only the people who are so secure are going to access relationships. But secondly, we deal with the worst case scenario, which fall under the standards of the relationship. This is essential because it's the most vulnerable point of the relationship, where the relationship is suffering to so much. We think that people will stay together because of the lack of transactionality. States grow extremely proud to Opus.
I'm bored.